friends in Washington that I was coming to Annapolis to give a talk on South Sudan. They seemed a bit surprised that the Navy would be interested in a landlocked country. So I thought I could talk about the campaign of the riverboats of Kitchener, or a more interesting one would be when the British tried their first invasion of Sudan. They did it in an expedition with specially constructed rowboats led by Canadian voyageurs. They didn't actually make it to Khartoum, so perhaps that's not the best example. However, I have been asked to write a short history of South Sudan. And as the Duke of Wellington famously wrote to a correspondent, I don't have time to write you a short letter, so I will write you a long letter. Writing short books takes a lot more work than writing long books, as I've found. And one of the problems of doing a short history of any country is the tendency to compress too much, to leave too much out, and to simplify. And the problem also with doing a short history of South Sudan is I'm not quite sure how it's going to end. And what I'm going to give you today is a preliminary draft of my final chapter, which is Legacies of War. So there's going to be quite a lot that's going to be left out, and I hope that you will ask me questions so that we can put things back in. Now, during London's 2012 Cultural Olympiad, the newly formed South Sudan Theatre Company performed Shakespeare's Cymbeline in the vernacular of Juba Arabic at the Globe Theatre to enthusiastic reviews. Now, Cymbeline is not one of Shakespeare's better-known plays. It depicts a small nation standing against a stronger military power's demand for tribute, while its own court is undermined by intrigue, treason, betrayal, and rape. Its production coincided with the eruption of fighting along the Sudan-South Sudan border. Let's see if I can work this. Whoops. There, okay, that's the wrong button. And which button do I?
The red laser.
Right. Okay, I hope that's the last glitch. The production coincided with the eruption of fighting along the Sudan-South Sudan border centered on the disputed Hijlij oil fields, as the comprehensive peace agreement began to look like a brief truce within a longer war. When we read this man Shakespeare, the play's translator and co-director explained, we think he is writing about us. We can see all our problems and stories in the play. Now, with nationhood, South Sudan has achieved cultural visibility. Prior to its independence, no Southern Sudanese theatre company would have represented Sudan in an international festival. It is part of a trend where South Sudanese football teams now compete with other nations' teams, and South Sudanese women represent their nation in regional and international beauty pageants. A celebration of South Sudanese cultural vitality, the production of Cymbeline nonetheless acknowledged South Sudan's uncertain future, its history of serial defections by its political and military leaders, and the violation of its women. The Comprehensive Peace Agreement resolved Sudan's longest-standing political question, which was whether South Sudanese could find or would find a place inside or outside the nation. It did not resolve the equally pressing problem of the state's relations with other marginalized peripheries, nor did it provide a blueprint for peaceful disengagement between Sudan and South Sudan, or for any process of reconciliation between communities affected by the war. Following formal independence on 9th July 2011, South Sudan was confronted with multiple challenges: implementing leftover issues from the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, dealing with Sudan's war in its new south along their common border, here, alleviating the impact of war on South Sudanese communities through finding a path towards reconciliation and reconstruction, and fashioning its own constitutional future. The first years of South Sudan's independence were marked by continued political and economic tension with Sudan, insecurity within parts of South Sudan, and internal political disputes within the ruling Sudan People's Liberation Movement, SPLM, leading finally to the outbreak of civil war in 2013. At independence, the two biggest unresolved issues between South Sudan and Sudan were their common border and the future of their once shared oil industry. The two issues intersected since most of the active oil fields were located within the border region. During the war, the SPLA, Sudan People's Liberation Army, secured most of South Sudan's international borders, along with Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and the DRC. And this control facilitated the international wartime relief effort and enabled the SPLA to carry on an informal economy of trade in gold, livestock, tropical hardwoods, and other commodities in exchange for petrol, vehicles, military supplies, as well as food and manufactured goods. Building on contacts established in the war, South Sudan was much more closely integrated into the regional economy of its neighbors at independence than it had been at the start of the war. The SPLA also had a strong presence along parts of the northern boundary of the old southern region, with its forces in Blue Nile and South Kordofan states. It controlled large sections of the boundaries of Upper Nile and Unity states. This is Upper Nile, this is Unity. In northern Bahr Ghazal, its forces also occupied the territory between the old provincial boundary with Darfur and the Kir Bahr Arab River, the area that would later be called Mile 14. The SPLA thus had both military forces and territorial claims north and south of the official boundary line stipulated in the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. The decision to use the 1 January 1956 provincial borders, that is the date of Sudan's independence, as the new international boundary was taken over from the 1972 Addis Ababa Agreement, which ended the first civil war, and its definition of the southern region. The difficulty in determining those boundaries rested on the fact that many had not been fully surveyed. Sudan's official maps often showed only approximate lines, and the documentary evidence of past administration on the ground was incomplete or, in some cases, missing. There also had been a series of past grazing agreements allowing pastoralists on the borderlands temporary access across provincial boundaries, and these were now being claimed as de facto administrative boundary lines. The main disputed territories were the Hofrat Nahas Kafia-Kinji districts, the Mile 14 region between the Malwal Dinka to the south and the Rizagat Bagara to the north, the Panthau Hijlij oil field between South Kordofan and Unity states, and several agricultural lands along the northern boundary of Upper Nile state. There's no resolution to any of these areas by the time the civil war in the south broke out in December 2013. Many of these territorial disputes had their origins in the condominium era decisions. The area of western Bahr Ghazal that contained Kafia-Kinji and the copper mines of Hofrat and Nahas had been considered a remote, difficult to administer, infested with tsetse fly, a danger to neighboring pastoralists, and a cultural and religious border zone. A renewed interest in the mineral content around the Hofrat Nahas, which are mines right on the border here, led to its annexation to Darfur in 1960. By the terms of the Addis Ababa Agreement, it should have been restored to the administration of Bahr Ghazal province, but was not. Sorry if I'm mentioning unfamiliar territorial names, and one of the problems here is that you will hear Arabic names and vernacular names because of the multiple claims to the territory. So when we talk about Hijlij oil field, you will also find that in South Sudan it is called Panthau. Tau is the Hijlij tree, and the Panthau just means the place of the Hijlij tree in Dinka, whereas Hijlij is the Arabic for a Hijlij tree. So you can understand it in either language. Okay. The forest of western Bahr Ghazal, the forest of tropical hardwoods, further enhanced its economic attraction not only to the two national governments, but to the competing state governments of South Darfur and western Bahr Ghazal. Yet over 50 years as part of Darfur has brought about demographic changes so that the current population of Kafia Kinji is less South Sudanese than it once was. The territories of Mile 14 and Panthau Hejlij contain disputed grazing areas, and South Sudan's case rests on the claims of its pastoralists. The Malwal Dinka were never reconciled to the annexation of their seasonal grazing lands south of the Bahr Arab Kir River in 1918. And the SPLA reoccupied the area during the war. The Hijlij oil field straddles the South Sudan unity border, and the active oil well is sited on seasonal grazing land used by the Alor, Awet, and Nok Dinka. Wherever the provincial boundary borderline was drawn in the past, the area was under the seasonal administration of neighboring provinces, and during the Civil War was the target of ethnic cleansing by the Sudanese army and allied militias in order to clear the area for the oil industry. South Sudan and Sudan share considerable economic interests along the borderlands, and the disputed territories are among those where those interests are the most dense. Seasonal cross-border pastoral movements require management if they're not to provoke conflict. Subterranean oil fields are not confined by or contained within boundaries above ground. Well-established cross-border trade links have long been vital to the internal economies of both countries. Yet both governments were willing to damage their own economies in order to hurt each other in 2012, when South Sudan temporarily shut down its pipeline to Port Sudan, its only means of exporting its oil, and Sudan retaliated by closing the border to all trade. The area of Abyei, here, is the home of a group of people called the Nok Dinka, and has similarities with the three territories I've just discussed. As with Kafia Kinji, it is unfinished business left over from the 1972 Addis Ababa Agreement, when that agreement promised a referendum on joining the southern region, but the referendum was never held. As with Mile 14, its ownership is disputed between competing Bagara Arab and Dinka pastoralists, and as with Panthau Hijlij, the presence of oil sharpened the competing claims of Khartoum and Juba. In the 1970s, an international development effort centered on the Nok Dinka increased resentment among the Missouri Bagara neighbors. During the 1980s and 1990s, Khartoum used local development projects to begin the demographic transformation of the area by settling Missouri in Nok Dinka territory. The Abyei Protocol of the CPA was supposed to provide a final and binding settlement by defining the boundaries of the Nok Dinka territory, which would be subject to a referendum held simultaneously with the South Sudanese referendum in 2011, allowing the Nok Dinka and other Sudanese residents the choice to remain part of South Kordofan or join South Sudan. As South Sudan prepared to vote in its January 2011 referendum, Khartoum began a military buildup in its new south, in Abyei, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile. Armed groups prevented the holding of the Abyei referendum, and the Sudanese army occupied Abyei in May. Despite the election campaign in South Kordofan, or during the election campaign in South Kordofan, Sudanese President Bashir threatened that Khartoum would, quote, go all out for war should the SPLM win. Ahmed Haroun, the National Congress Party candidate, that is the ruling party of Sudan, Ahmed Haroun, the NCP candidate for governor of the state, who was also indicted by the ICC for war crimes in Darfur, was declared the winner by only 6,000 votes over his SPLM North rival. International observers rushed to proclaim the election fair, but there were good grounds for disputing this. Khartoum declared then that the SPLA units in South Kordofan who were there under the terms of the CPA should either be removed to South Sudan or disarmed. Now, these soldiers were not Southern Sudanese, they were local Nuba, and no provision had been made in the CPA for what would happen to them following the outcome of the Southern referendum or the popular consultations. In June, the Sudan Armed Forces launched an attack on the SPLM North units and targeted SPLM North officials. The UN mission in Sudan and other agencies documented numerous violations of human rights and international humanitarian laws by the government forces in both Abyei and the Nuba Mountains during the fighting. Malik Agar, who was the governor of Blue Nile State and a member of the SPLM North, tried to negotiate an agreement with Khartoum with the help of Ethiopia's Prime Minister Meles Zenawi. And while an agreement was signed in Addis Ababa by the National Congress Party Assistant President Nafi Ali Nafi, it was immediately repudiated by President Bashir. In September, the Sudanese army launched its long-anticipated attack on Blue Nile State and declared Malik Agar the most accommodating of the SPLM, declared Malik Agar, who was the most accommodating of the SPLM North leaders. He was proclaimed a rebel. Thousands of refugees fled into neighboring Ethiopia and South Sudan, while the Sudanese Air Force bombed refugee camps inside South Sudan. A new war, replicating the patterns of previous wars, had begun. Both Juba and Khartoum supported each other's armed opposition along their common border, but the fighting in Sudan's New South was not a proxy war between the two countries. The CPA had denied the peoples of Blue Nile and the Nuba Mountains their right to self-determination by subordinating that right to South Sudan's. Freed from the dominance of South Sudanese priorities, the SPLA North was able to form its own alliances with other Sudanese opposition groups, linking up with such Darfur forces as the Justice and Equality Movement, who expanded their own operations into South and North Kordofan. Security issues along the border came to dominate South Sudan's relations with Sudan, delaying resolutions of the border, oil fees, and Abyei. Relations thawed with an agreement in 2013 to cease supporting each other's armed opposition, but the impact of that thaw on South Sudan's internal politics helped precipitate the crisis at the end of the year. A number of officials hostile to Khartoum were dismissed from the cabinet and their party positions and were replaced by persons with more flexible attitudes, some of whom were former members of the National Congress Party. South Sudan's National Security Service became much more active against internal political dissent. After the SPLM's political confrontation erupted into violence in December 2013, there was a gradual convergence of both countries' civil wars. While professing support for Juba, Khartoum helped to arm its opposition forces. Khartoum's opposition, the Justice and Equality Movement in particular, allied with Juba in combating the advance of the opposition forces in Upper Nile and Unity states. The two wars have become intertwined. One of the major contributing factors in South Sudan's post-independence crisis was the failure to use the 6-year interim period between the signing of the CPA and the independence referendum to confront directly the internal wounds of the civil war and promote the reconciliation between South Sudanese communities. There had been militia activity for 22 years of war. These were organized groups who were not necessarily part of the armies of either the government or of the SPLA, but they were organized as independent militia groups who were mainly involved in attacking civilian communities. The highest concentration of militia activity was in the so-called Greater Upper Nile area, including Jonglei, Upper Nile, and Unity, and along the northern Bahr Ghazal border with Kordofan and Darfur. This involved a certain amount of abductions, You might have heard about the revival of slavery along the Bahr-Ghazal-Darfur border in the 1990s. And it also displaced there were large displaced populations as a result of raids that were aimed at the destruction of the subsistence economy. In northern Bahr-Ghazal, displaced people became a form of captured labor as they were brought north into mechanized farming area projects. In Jonglei, internal refugees were scattered throughout camps and settlements further south in this area of the equatorial states, often leading to disputes between local farmers and refugees with their cattle. In Greater Upper Nile, especially in Jonglei State, the confrontation between there was the confrontation between the SPLA and Khartoum-backed militias, particularly, for instance, a group known as the Murle, who were armed by Khartoum and organized to fight not just the SPLA, but their local neighbors, the Dinka here and the Nuer. Militias were used to clear the oil fields here. And after the breakdown or the breakup of the SPLA in the 1990s, when the Nasser faction of the SPLA under Riek Machar allied with the government, a Nuer civil war broke out in Unity and Jonglei states as different groups of Nuer began fighting each other. And therefore there was a much higher concentration of civilian casualties in these areas during this civil war between armed civilian groups, and it's remembered now as much worse for civilians than when the SPLA was fighting the government or when different factions of the SPLA were fighting each other. Now, the impact on civilians was a militarization of the youth. The age set system was absorbed into the recruitment into the armies and the militias. And therefore you had a large number of civilians, young men, who'd not necessarily had military training, but had been exposed to military organization and were armed. There was also an impact on women, not only the rise of rape, but the erosion of child spacing practices in domestic arrangements, as returning soldiers would want to have get their wives pregnant, even if they were still suckling children. So there was something of a breakdown there in the way in which pregnancies were regulated and spaced more or less every 2 years. Women normally didn't get pregnant when they were still weaning children. Perhaps most importantly, there was a need for formal peacemaking and reconciliation processes between communities formerly at war with each other. Now, these processes are well known in the South Sudan because they were regularly conducted under government supervision, whether during the condominium period under the British or under Northern Sudanese governments after independence, or South Sudanese governments during the time of the Southern Regional Government. They're very well known what the process is and how they are to be conducted between communities who have been fighting each other. These did not take place. There was a deliberate policy to avoid acknowledging that there was a need for reconciliation. Instead, there were heavy-handed disarmament campaigns, especially in the Jonglei area, which tended to inflame passions as people would rearm themselves for protection. And you had a series of guerrilla operations in the 2010s where different dissident officials who'd fallen out with the SPLA would be getting arms surreptitiously from Khartoum and funneling them into civilian communities. So that, for instance, you had groups of Nuer from this area getting weapons to be able to fight groups of Murle in this area. And you had a revival of Murle militias under a man called David Yao Yao, who was getting arms shipped to him by helicopter from Khartoum. This was a situation that was escalating throughout 2011, 2012, of very serious fighting, but it also meant that there were large numbers of civilians with fairly sophisticated weapons, not just the AK-47s, but RPGs, heavy machine guns, even mortars. And this was to have serious consequences in the current civil war that is now affecting South Sudan. Should say something about that. It's a little bit complicated. But there was one of the crisis that South Sudan faced stemmed from a failure to confront the real problems of constructing a constitutional future for the country. It started within the SPLM, which was the ruling party, and it was also a problem within the SPLA, which was the National Army. It's a problem that you find in many areas of converting a guerrilla movement into a civil government, and even converting a guerrilla army into a professional army. Reform of the army, of the SPLA, was put on hold during the 6-year interim period as different militia groups were absorbed into the SPLA, but not really integrated into the army or trained. You had a number of high-ranking officers who were functionally illiterate or actually illiterate. And the reason why there wasn't a more active reform of the army was that until 2011, the government in Juba thought that they were going to need the army to fight a war with Khartoum if Khartoum tried to prevent the independence referendum to take place in 2011. Similarly, there was no reform of the ruling party. The SPLM is not a political party in a real sense. It does not have branches, constituencies that build up leadership from the bottom to the top. It is really more of a chain of command rather than a real party. And these two issues converged in 2013 as a result of the fact that a presidential election is scheduled for 2015. And the issue of who was going to run for president, i.e. who was going to be the SPLM's candidate, and therefore the sole candidate for president, brought a political crisis to a head within the movement. And these two issues about the reform of the party and the reform of the army converged in 2013, when a confrontation in the party national executive led to a breakout of fighting within the SPLA in Juba. And this then escalated as a revolt led by Riek Machar for a second time, took hold in this, especially in this area, where there were already armed civilian groups who had been arming themselves as a result of insecurity in this area and fighting their neighbors or defending themselves. And that was the bulk of the fighting force that the opposition then rallied in fighting the government. I won't go into that much further in more detail unless you want me to. It is rather complex. Now, what is there a hope for the future in South Sudan? Well, quite clearly, there's always hope for the future in any country. And there will come a time when the people who are the old guard of the revolution, so to speak, pass away or kill each other. There will be a time when a new generation of leadership takes place. And one of the things that I see as a hope for the future is in the group of South Sudanese diaspora. Now, they haven't had much of an influence on the central institutions of the country yet. During 22 years of civil war, you had a lot of people who were displaced and became refugees in Ethiopia, in Kenya, in Uganda. And you had also a series of what were known as secondary resettlement, when a lot of people were taken out of these refugee camps and taken to countries like the United States, Canada, Australia. Interestingly, not very much to the United Kingdom. And very often, the people who were taken out of the refugee camps were the people who already had a level of education and a command of English that would enable them to benefit from resettlement in these countries. And quite a few of them have become very prominent, or should I say, very successful in gaining skills and experience in various fields, in small businesses. And they have been very much in touch with, not so much with the central institutions as with local level individual projects. You did have at the end of the war, when people were coming back to Sudan, South Sudan, looking for government appointments, the feeling that the people who had been fighting, whatever their qualifications, should be given preference in government jobs. And so somebody who'd been teaching at a university in Canada, coming back looking for a senior position either in the university or in the Ministry of Education, was asked, was there a bush in Canada? i.e., did you go off to the bush and fight? How could you do that if you were in Canada? So these people haven't necessarily been at the center of the governmental institutions of the country. However, they have been very active in forming what are known as civil society organizations. There is a South Sudan Law Association with very well qualified, well experienced legal members who have been looking into constitutional issues, very much concerned with the issue of accountability of war crimes, very much involved in the debate of how do we bring about transitional justice in the country as a result of these new extensive violations of human rights, either by government forces or by opposition forces. You also have think tanks. Now, think tanks are a little bit problematic, obviously, when you go to K Street in Washington. But for a country that needs to have independent analysis of economic issues, of political issues, of constitutional issues, etc., these are institutions that are beginning to make a difference, possibly not having a great deal of influence on the leadership of the country or on the education of the population. But they are beginning to make a difference because of their output of well-researched, well-analyzed, well-argument positions, which can and are beginning to become part of the dialogue within the country, or at least within the leadership. So what the crisis has revealed is the vitality of the number of civil society organizations and the wide range of expertise they draw on from the diaspora and within South Sudan. And these institutions are also reaching across the regional and ethnic divisions of the nation. And that, I say, that is where I see some hope, if not for the immediate future, for the long-term future of the country. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Maybe there's some questions from the students for Dr. Johnson.
I just have a quick question. I want to hear a little bit more about the think tanks, about the different topics for the think tanks.
Think tanks, okay. These are very often organized by persons who still have jobs outside of South Sudan, and who, for instance, there is an institution called the Sud Institute. Now the Sud, S-U-D-D, is Arabic for an obstruction or a dam, and South Sudan is famous for its large papyrus swamp in the middle of the Nile basin here, which is known as the Sud. And this has been organized by a man who is currently a professor of history and anthropology at Loyola University in Los Angeles, and able to put in grant applications and get funding from various external bodies like USAID or the US Institute for Peace. And so they provide a home for local researchers to look into specific questions, policy issues. You also have what you wouldn't call a civil society organization, but there's now a Center for Peace and Development Studies at the University of Juba, which is again very much involved in or requiring external funding. But you have right now a debate, a very strong debate in South Sudan over the issue of federalism. Should the country be organized as a federal state with a number of federal states and a central government? Or should it go on as it is currently with a fairly centralized government and a modicum of decentralization? And this has been a debate that has been very much influenced by the department, the Center for Peace and Development Studies in University of Juba. The head of that department holds a doctorate in development studies from the University of Sussex, was formerly the Minister of Presidential Affairs in Juba, and has held a visiting position at the Kennedy School of Government in Harvard. So a person with wide-ranging experience outside of South Sudan and also within South Sudan. And in a way, I was involved in this last July when I was asked to give a lecture on the history of federalism in South Sudanese political thought. I hadn't realized when I chose the topic that the government had banned all discussion of federalism. Despite that, the lecture went ahead even though the organizer got a call from somebody in government, he didn't tell me who, that it should not go ahead. But about 700 people showed up, not really to hear me, but to hear the discussion that would take place after a formal lecture. And the University of Juba did this very deliberately to make a point that the university was a place for open discussion of important national issues. And the response of the government was a little bit ambiguous. The lecture apparently was filmed and showed on South Sudan TV, which is a government station. There was a report on the lecture in a newspaper, and all copies of that newspaper were seized by security. And then a few of us were on a radio phone-in show the following Monday in Radio Moriah, which is Moriah FM, which is a Catholic radio station. And while that went ahead, that station has since then had been shut down from time to time. It still operates, but it has been targeted by security. So it's this sort of thing, these sorts of institutions that are trying to create a space. They are being run by people who have quite a lot of international experience and exposure. They do depend, however, on external funding, of being able to tap into the types of funding that come from abroad, and that is probably where their greatest vulnerability is.
Sir, there was a media report released or leaked
Yes, I will just point out that the book that you very kindly showed has gone through several editions. It now has a green cover, and if you get a copy of that, you will see my critique of the CPA. However, that particular document was leaked seems to have been a draft by one person in the AU Commission, Mahmoud Mamdani, who is currently a public intellectual, this is how he describes himself, in the United States, and had always been very hostile to the idea of an independent South Sudan. There are a number of problems with that document because it quotes witnesses and gives their names and positions. So now it is known who it was who was documenting, giving that commission documentation about the atrocities that were committed. But to take your question, it has now become very fashionable for people to blame the United States, and particularly Hollywood actors like George Clooney, for the independence of South Sudan and for the current political crisis. And I think that this is, it's sort of like looking under, if you lose if you lose a quarter in a dark alley, you go and look for it under a lamp because there is greater light under the lamp. It is focusing on what people know, which is Hollywood activists and US government, and not focusing on what they do not know, which is the political history of Sudan and South Sudan. There's been a very long history of political struggle. And as I said, the central political question that confronted Sudan since before independence in 1956 was, what was the relationship going to be between the central government in Khartoum and its wide periphery of marginalized people, including South Sudan. And South Sudanese political thought has been very consistent since about 1951 of the conditions for unity, where South Sudanese, if given a vote, would be able to decide either to remain as part of the Sudan or to become independent. Now, the problem with the CPA was that it was the mediators who set up the context for the negotiations were very largely ignorant of this history, political history of Sudan. The civil war in Sudan that started in 1983 has usually been described in the press as a war between the Christian African South and the Arab Muslim North. And by 2002, when the negotiations started, this war could no longer be described as that, because you had a large number of Muslim Sudanese who were fighting as part of the Sudan People's Liberation Army. And whereas in the southern provinces, there was a strong sentiment that what we want is independence, within the areas that I pointed out here, and even in the eastern Sudan, as well as later Darfur, which was a related conflict but not part of the original conflict, the arguments were not about independence. They were not wanting to become part of South Sudan. They wanted a different form of government. And what you have to remember is that after Nimeri, who was a strong, got strong US support, was overthrown in 1985, there was a brief period of a parliamentary period, and by 1989, that parliamentary government had come to the realization that they had to negotiate with the SPLA for an end to the war. And at that time, independence for South Sudan was not high on the priority of the SPLA or the SPLM. They were still fighting for something that they called the New Sudan, which was a reorganized government so that you did not have, which was a secular government or a non-sectarian government. And the negotiations were going to start in June of 1989 and were stopped in June 30th, 1989, when the Islamist-backed coup took over and put Bashir in power. So if the Sudan had been negotiating in 1989, the idea of self-determination for South Sudan alone would have not been anywhere on the table. By 2002, you did have a kind of a divergence within the opposition. Still, there was this idea of the new Sudan. We want to reform the country. We do not want an Islamic state. We, Muslims within the SPLA, do not want an Islamic state. We do not want the type of Islamic state that the Bashir government had put in power. This was not recognized by Senator Danforth, who was sentenced. His report took at face value the Khartoum government's claim that they represented the Muslim majority. Now, this is a government that came to power by the gun, and then talked merely about offering South Sudan some sort of form of going back to regional autonomy of pre-1983. This was no solution. And then, of course, the people outside southern Sudan who were part of the war were left out with no options, no involvement. And that was the basic weakness of the CPA. The basic weakness was not that people in the United States were getting behind South Sudanese independence. The basic weakness was that it did not understand the real causes of the war or the real issues.
Let's thank Dr. Johnson for his time. We can't let you leave without our obligatory photo album of the U.S. Naval Academy as a small token of our appreciation for your lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time today. I'm smarter on the Sudan now than when I came in the room.
As I explained to my host earlier, my grandfather joined the U.S. Naval Air Force during the First World War. He didn't come through here, and he didn't rise to any higher rank than an ensign. But then the uniform of the U.S. Naval Air Force at the time was olive drab, and of course the ensign has a star on his epaulet.
Wow.
And on one occasion at least, in a crowded train, as my grandfather was trying to go through a corridor, an Army officer snapped to attention and saluted. And my grandfather rather patronizingly said, "As you were, Colonel," and went on.
That's pretty good.
I will
Thank you for your
just want to recommend somebody else's book, which has just come out by Eddie Thomas, South Sudan, A Slow Liberation, which has more detail about some of these issues than I was able to go into.